You think the giant sloth was just a bigger version of the slow, harmless animal hanging in trees today. Gentle, clumsy, easy prey. But in reality, it was the opposite. This was not a creature that hid from the world. It reshaped it. It stood taller than a human. It carried claws longer than knives. And it lived in a time when the ground itself belonged to animals that did not need to run, did not need to rush, because nothing could easily challenge them. The giant sloth wasn't a mistake of evolution, it was a warning. To understand the giant sloth, you have to let time run backward. Not thousands of years, not even tens of thousands. You have to step into the late Ice Age, roughly 50,000 years ago, when the Americas were not yet shaped by cities, fences, or silence. This was a world stretched to extremes. South America was a continent of open woodlands, dry grasslands, and fractured forests. North America, when the sloths arrived, was colder, harsher. Its seasons sharp enough to kill the unprepared. There were no quiet landscapes here. The ground trembled under the weight of animals the size of trucks. Predators watched from the edges of trees built to tear through muscle and bone. The air carried the constant smell of decay and growth layered together. And through this world moved slow shapes, so massive they did not need speed. As the planet cooled, glaciers advanced and retreated like breathing lungs, sea levels fell, land bridges appeared, time didn't flow forward here. It folded back on itself. And in that folding world, the giant sloth made sense. At first glance, the giant sloth feels almost familiar. The face is wrong, but recognizable. The posture feels awkward, but intentional. It looks like something you already understand, until you notice the scale. This animal did not hang from branches, it pulled trees apart. Some species, like Megatherium, stood over 6 meters tall when reared up, a living wall of muscle, fur, and bone. Others, like a Mylodon, were shorter, broader, built like armored barrels with claws designed for leverage, not finesse. Those claws were not for climbing. They were for hooking trunks, dragging branches down, and stripping entire trees of leaves in minutes. Its bones were dense, unnaturally dense. So heavy, they suggest an animal that expected to absorb impact, not avoid it. The giant sloth moved slowly, but not weakly. Every step was deliberate, every movement economical. There is something unsettling about that design. It wasn't optimized to flee, it wasn't optimized to chase, it was optimized to stand its ground. This was a creature that did not live in fear of its environment. It lived as if the environment would eventually move out of its way. The giant sloth didn't live in a peaceful world, it lived among monsters. Saber-toothed cats with jaws built to puncture thick hide, short-faced bears that could outrun horses, dire wolves that hunted in coordinated packs, testing weakness with patience, and yet the giant sloth did not vanish into forests or hide behind speed. It stayed visible. When threatened, some species could rear up on their hind legs, balancing on a massive tail like a third pillar. In that posture, the sloth became a tower of bone and muscle, claws arcing outward, capable of ripping flesh or breaking ribs with a single swipe. This wasn't hypothetical. Sloth bones show signs of healed fractures. They survived injuries that would have killed most mammals. Predators didn't attack casually. They learned. The environment itself was just as brutal. Ice Age climates were unstable, decades of abundance followed by sudden collapse. Droughts stripped landscapes bare. Cold snaps froze ecosystems in place. Plants disappeared, then returned changed. The giant sloth needed enormous amounts of food. Entire feeding grounds could be destroyed by a single climate shift. And then there was something new. Quiet, upright, watching. Humans arrived without claws, without size, without speed, but with patience, coordination, and memory. They didn't need to overpower the sloth, they only needed to wait. In this world, danger didn't always rush in screaming. Sometimes it approached slowly, just like the sloth itself. But the strange thing is, it doesn't work the way we thought it did. For a long time, scientists imagined the giant sloth as a lumbering herbivore, too slow to matter, too specialized to adapt. A relic, waiting patiently for extinction. The evidence doesn't agree. Microscopic wear on sloth teeth suggests a surprisingly flexible diet. Not just soft leaves, but tougher vegetation. Possibly even roots, bark, or fallen fruit scavenged from the ground. And then there's the metabolism. Bone chemistry hints that giant sloths weren't operating at full mammalian speed. Their internal clocks may have been slower, conserving energy in ways modern animals don't. Not inefficient. Strategic. Some researchers have even questioned how predictable their behavior really was. An animal that moves slowly does not think slowly. It plans. It remembers. This changes everything. If giant sloths were adaptable, dietary generalists with energy-saving physiology, then their disappearance wasn't inevitable. They weren't evolutionary dead ends. They were survivors, which means something else had to break, not the animal, the system around it. For all the bones we've uncovered, the giant sloth is still unfinished. We don't know how fast it could really move. Trackways suggest something between a shuffle and a purposeful stride. But speed leaves no fossil behind. Neither does fear. We don't know how it behaved socially. Some sites suggest solitary lives. Others hint at loose groupings, shared feeding grounds, overlapping paths worn into ancient soil. Even its relationship with predators is unclear. Was it mostly left alone? Or did young sloths fall regularly, feeding Ice Age carnivores we've only reconstructed from teeth and scars? And then there's the strangest question of all. Was the giant sloth always an herbivore? Cut marks on bones are easy to identify, bite marks too. But absence is harder. A claw that can pull down trees could also open carcasses. Some scientists cautiously suggest opportunistic omnivory, rare, situational, uncomfortable to imagine. Others reject it completely. The fossils don't argue back. What we're left with are fragments. A pelvis thicker than a human torso, claws shaped for leverage, bones built to endure violence. The giant sloth is not a solved animal. It's a silhouette, filled in differently depending on who is looking. And that uncertainty is part of what makes it dangerous to underestimate. The giant sloth did not fade away gently. It vanished in pieces. Across the Americas, the climate lurched instead of shifting. Ice sheets retreated faster than ecosystems could stabilize. Forests fragmented. Grasslands rearranged themselves. Familiar feeding routes broke apart. For an animal built on consistency, this mattered. But climate alone doesn't explain the timing. Wherever humans arrived, the giant sloths disappeared soon after. Not instantly, not dramatically, but reliably. A creature that reproduced slowly could not afford sustained losses. One adult killed was not just a meal. It was decades of future offspring erased. And humans didn't need to hunt many. They only needed to hunt enough. There is no evidence of panic, no final stand, no single moment of collapse, just absence. By 12,000 years ago, the continent-scale engineers were gone. The trees they shaped grew differently. The landscapes they opened closed in. The giant sloth didn't lose a battle. It lost time. And in a world suddenly moving faster than it ever had before, even something built to endure could not keep up. The world we live in is quieter than it should be. Forests without giant sloths grow denser, darker. Trees compete upward instead of outward. Open woodlands close in on themselves. Ecologists call this ghost influence. The shape of ecosystems still responding to animals that are no longer there. Some plants bear fruits far too large for any living animal to swallow whole. Their seeds scatter poorly now, rolling only short distances before rotting. They were designed for mouths that no longer exist. Even modern sloths are echoes. Their slow metabolism, their low energy lives, their strange indifference to urgency, these aren't flaws. They are survival strategies scaled down to fit a diminished world. When we look at them today, we see something incomplete, a version that learned how to disappear. The giant sloth didn't just vanish from the fossil record. It left behind a planet still adjusting to its absence. Imagine encountering a giant sloth today, not in a zoo, not behind glass, on an empty road, at the edge of a forest that no longer remembers how it used to grow. It wouldn't charge. It wouldn't flee. It would stand up slowly, measuring you with senses shaped for a world without haste. And in that moment, you wouldn't feel fear because it was aggressive. You'd feel fear because it didn't need to be. We like to believe extinction removes threats, that the past was more dangerous than the present. But the giant sloth didn't disappear because it was too strange, too slow, or too brutal. It disappeared because the rules changed. And as we walk through a world built from those changes, lighter, faster, quieter, we should be grateful. Not that the giant sloth is gone, but that we were never forced to learn how to live beside it.